G'day, I'm Martyn Iles and welcome to The Truth of It, ACL's weekly newscast on politics and current events where we cut through the fake news and bring you what it says on the tin, which is the truth of it. And today I want to kick off with the big news of the last week, which is that the government has released, by way of Christian Porter, the Attorney General, the first draft of the long-awaited religious discrimination bill. Now, ACL's been there at every step of the process on this, trying to put input into the result and trying to get some good protections into that bill to make it a really worthwhile thing. We've been speaking with the drafters of the bill, with the Attorney General's office, and so on and so on. Finally, it's here. A first draft, which the Attorney General is inviting further comment on. And one of the things you might have noticed if you've been following this is that there's been somewhat divided opinion. Some people are in favour, some people are against. I think there's a reason for that divided opinion. And it is essentially this. The bill has some pretty incredible headline offerings. When you simply go through a shopping list of what the bill purports to give us, you think, wow, that's really, really good. But you know what, and no pun intended, given this is a religious discrimination bill, but the devil is in the detail. And we say that and we mean it, because when you look at the headline offering, which looks so great, and then you look at the detail of what the section actually says, you go, oh, it's like the bill gives, and then through the details and the exceptions that are provided, it takes away. So many times. Let me give you some examples. I'll go through firstly these great headline offerings, which are going to look fantastic. 5 of them. The first one is this. Well, the bill obviously establishes that we can't be discriminated against because of religion in a range of areas: accommodation, employment, professional accreditation, that kind of thing. That's the first thing. Great. Secondly, religious bodies, which doesn't just include churches, but the bill specifically says it includes faith-based charities and it includes faith-based educational institutions. Great. But religious bodies can act in accordance with their beliefs. They're free to do that. To do so is not discrimination. So you can think, for example, a faith-based school teaching the Bible, or having policies that uphold their beliefs about gender, so bathrooms and things like that. Or perhaps an educational institution or another entity that wants to hire people who share their faith. Good. It all looks great. Excellent. Thirdly, employers cannot act against an employee because they have made what's called a statement of belief. So they've gone out there in their private life or said something and made a statement of belief. Well, the employee can't act against them. You think, well, that protects Israel Folau, surely. Well, looks like it, doesn't it? Looks great. Fourthly, Section 17 of the Tasmanian Anti-Discrimination Act, which is the section, if you remember, that says that you can't do or say anything that might offend somebody. And so Archbishop Julian Porteous and others have been caught by this. So Julian Porteous put out a pastoral letter on the church's beliefs about marriage. It's a very gentle sort of a thing, but someone said, hey, guess what? I'm offended. Took him to the Anti-Discrimination Commission. This sort of thing's been going on down there a lot. Well, this act actually specifically names that section, and it says, do you know what? A statement of belief cannot be in contravention of that section. So you think, wow, it looks like it protects Julian Porteous. It looks like it protects others like Campbell Markham who have been caught by that. Looks good. And fifthly, the fifth major one I'll point out is there is actually a section in there that relates to health practitioners. And it says there that if they conscientiously object to providing a medical service, well, they're protected. So you think of a doctor who doesn't want to refer for an abortion or provide an abortion or something like that. 5 things, 5 key things among several that are there, but 5 key things that look good. Now let me do a little case study on how that when you get into the details, you find problems. Firstly, I said that you can't be discriminated against on the basis of religion in a whole range of areas. But there's a question. What's actually protected? So if I or another person of faith was to apply for a job or was to apply for accommodation or was to be accredited by a law society or some other body that gives accreditations, what is the thing that they cannot discriminate against me on the basis of? And the Act actually puts it this way. It says lawful religious activity. Now, there's 2 issues with this. One is with lawful, but it's a bit technical. I don't want to get into it. The thing that I'm concerned about is one not many people have actually mentioned, and it is that phrase religious activity. Now, you think about it. What do we want protection from? We actually want protection for engaging in activities that are consistent with our religion, not activities that are intrinsically religious. You think of a court answering that question. Is an Instagram post a religious activity? It's a social activity, it's a public activity, how many categories can you think of? But is it intrinsically religious? I think it's very much open to a court to say no, it's not, because courts already have distinguished, as we shall see, between religious and commercial activities, for example, as if your faith stops as soon as you open the cash register. Well, this is a very narrow protection. I can see that it would protect, going to church. It would protect singing praises to God in church, praying, things that are intrinsically, inherently, by their very core nature, religious. But what about those things that we do in public life that are consistent with our religious faith? Are they religious activities? The way court precedents have been going, maybe not. So actually, at the very core of the act, the thing which is defined as the religion that's protected, religious activity, well, I'm not sure that that's enough. I'm not sure that it cuts the mustard. So it fails there. Secondly, however, I mentioned that religious bodies are protected, including educational institutions, charities. They are allowed to engage in conduct that's consistent with their beliefs. But this section, it then says, yes, but not if that charity or whatever is primarily engaged in commercial activities. You go, well, hang on a second. So again, as I said before, the cash register opens and the faith stops, does it? What about a faith-based charity that's in the provision of childcare services at a heavily subsidised rate? Is that not commercial activity, charging fees for a service? Is there not any number of myriads of things that religious bodies do through healthcare provision and all sorts that may in fact involve charging of fees or selling of goods or some service, or even if they did that as a sideline to some other work that they were doing to try and raise money for it? At what point does commercial activity become a problem, and therefore that charity and that faith-based group, just because they're selling stuff, is no longer allowed to act consistent with their beliefs? That to me is a huge hole in the whole thing. Thirdly, I mentioned the fallow clause that says, well, for a statement of belief, an employer cannot act against an employee. But it's ruined by what I call a quantus clause, because it actually says in the exemptions to that, it says, but the employer can act against the employee if it's necessary to avoid unjustifiable financial hardship. Well, hang on a second. That's exactly what Rugby Australia claimed. That's exactly what they said. They said this is necessary to avoid unjust financial hardship. Our sponsors are going to pull out. Nobody wants to be associated with this. We have to act against him. Not only that, but it enables sponsors in that conduct, because they know that if they put the pressure on, then there's an excuse structure for Rugby Australia to make the decision. Or indeed, it enables boycotts. It enables Twitter storms against companies that are associated with different people, or for people to call politicians to come out and put pressure on from the LGBT side of the spectrum and things like that. And straight away, companies can go, well, look, this is going to cause financial hardship. We're going to lose service. It's going to ruin our reputation, and so they can take action against somebody for a mere statement of belief, and that's fine. The Act enables the fallow case. It doesn't prevent it at all. Not only that, but under this statements of belief section, there's a limit. It says, well, actually, if a statement of belief could vilify or harass a person or group of persons, then it's not protected at all in any circumstances. The trouble is, the word vilify, I'm not sure where you find that defined in law. I don't find the word vilify in any other legislation. I found it in the Act that existed temporarily to ensure a good environment for same-sex marriage debates, which was around for a few months during that debate. But that's fallen away now. It's no longer applicable. I haven't seen judicial consideration of this word in legislation. And these days, as we all know, people consider all sorts of things to be vilifying. All you need to do is disagree or say something that questions or doesn't affirm. And well, that could vilify, that could stir up hatred, this is the way they talk. And so there's a strange limitation there, which frankly is too low a bar. I mean, it sounds like a very serious thing, and all those who try and stand up against it will look bad, but actually in its legal application, it's very important that we point it out. So statements of belief, to what extent are they protected? Well, in the details, turns out not much. In fact, an employer can actually impose rules of conduct on their staff of any description, even if they limit statements of belief, even if they limit religious freedom, even if they discriminate on the basis of religion. It says here, so long as they are reasonable. Reasonable. We've done a lot of cases, including workplaces, where employees have said, well, it's been necessary for us to fire that person, or necessary for us to put in a rule that says absolutely no mention of faith at work, etc., because we want our employees to feel safe. Now, is that reasonable? Probably, yeah. Could be. So what good is this? Potentially none. Or you go on to the Porteous Clause that I mentioned, which is the one that targets that law in Tasmania and says, oh, well, a statement of belief doesn't breach that law. And so what it does is it says, well, just because someone could be offended by you doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that you can't do it. You can do it. However, it just puts in that same old standard, vilify and harass. Again, we're not quite sure what that means. Again, it probably doesn't solve anything because of the uncertainty. Again, people can allege that and pursue an anti-discrimination complaint for the smallest of things. Or finally, I mentioned health practitioners, and I said, well, health practitioners, apparently, there's a section in there if they conscientiously object to providing a health service, but it very quickly goes into exemptions. And what does it say? Well, it says, if it would adversely affect the health of the patient, well, they can't do that. Well, who knows when it's an abortion, adversely affecting the health, it's not even health care. Also, it says, well, it doesn't override state laws. So there you go. You've got permission for Victoria to persist with its laws, Queensland to persist with its laws, New South Wales, if it gets its laws soon, persist with those. It's a toothless tiger. It does absolutely nothing. And also overall, there's nothing in this Act whatsoever that protects service providers if they want to conscientiously object to participating in same-sex weddings. And you remember that this whole process started a couple of years ago now when same-sex marriage was legislated. This is how we got here through a long process, and it seems like that's been completely forgotten. The bill gives and it takes away. It has great headline statements that look good, and in the details, it completely undermines what it claims to do. Now, I hope that this is not deceptive. I hope that it's merely drafting error. I think I'm being very generous in saying that. You get very skeptical in a job like this when you see the way politics works. But see, it looks that way. I trust it's not deceptive. It could even be in there, for example, to have people say, well, look, neither side's happy. The pro-same-sex marriage types are not happy, the LGBT communities are not that happy because they don't like religious freedom, and the Christians are not that happy because it doesn't go far enough. So it's probably a good act. It's not a good act because it gives and takes away. It's a whole lot of legal verbiage which achieves very little. I'd rather not have a whole lot of legal verbiage on the statute books for judges to wallow around in and do crazy things with. It needs to be clear. It needs to be clarified. Now, there's a consultation process which is opened up now. And that's where we're headed next. And we'll be there at the first round table. We'll be there speaking to the Attorney General later on as well. We trust that by highlighting these issues, the AG, the Attorney General, is on the side of freedom and he does something about it. Let me say briefly though, some people say, well, why religious freedom? Why pursue it? I've dealt with this extensively in previous episodes. But I want to say something which I've noticed lately, and that is that so often what we actually call religious freedom could really be called freedom for the truth. Because it is overwhelmingly today the truth tellers that are getting into trouble. And you think of those lightning rod issues that create these discrimination cases, that create these legal cases against people of faith. Usually there's something in those cases about what they've said or done or what the institution believes around transgenderism, for example, gender issues, around sexuality, around life. So often you see people trying to suppress the pro-life side of things. But who in those cases is getting targeted? It is nearly always those who tell the truth about these issues. Those who say that God made male and female. Those who say that transgenderism is not all that the activists crack it up to be. Those who say that actually a child is a human being worthy of protection, it's a sacred life. That's who faces the music. And it's always weaponization of law against truth. I used to think at one stage in my political development that freedom was what we were fighting for. I'm not so sure. We use the language of freedom, but actually we live in a time when we are fighting for the truth. And we are fighting for the truth to be free. And the Apostle Paul says, pray for your governments. Why? Well, firstly, for religious freedom, that the godly life would be a life of peace. And secondly, because God desires all people everywhere to come to a knowledge of the truth. And insofar as the government passes laws or activists use laws to shut down avenues to a knowledge of the truth, Christian institutions not able to promote the truth, Christian individuals not able to speak the truth, and so on and so forth, insofar as that's going on in a society, it's a bad thing. Rather, God's will is that the truth would be enabled to be proclaimed at all times to as many people as possible, that many may come to its knowledge and be blessed by it. And as Christians, that's our mandate, to witness to the truth of the gospel in word and deed all the time. And so if you're a Christian and you're not interested in religious freedom, you need to be, because it goes to the very heart of what Christians are called to do in this world. Okay, moving on. I'm turning to the issue of abortion once again. I've dealt with many aspects of this over the last few weeks. The whole of Season 3 has had something on abortion in every episode. But today I'm dealing with something quite specific. I'm dealing with some of the arguments that I've observed from pro-choicers or pro-abortion people. And I want to note something about those arguments. It seems to me more generally that they've actually gone through something of a metamorphosis over a period of time. It was once the case, you see, that arguments for abortion were designed around the idea of trying to say, well, it's not actually the killing of a child. It's not actually the taking of a life. It's not actually the removal of the opportunity for a human being to live, and therefore it's not morally reprehensible. It's not what you say it is. And they said, well, it's not a person, for example. It's my body. It's one body, or therefore I can choose. Or it's a matter of healthcare, not a matter of human rights, because it's so inconsequential. It's just like expelling waste from the body. It's a clump of cells. It's a product of conception. And you had all of these arguments. But of course, over time, science has been against us on these things. Science showed us what we always knew. Science showed us that it's not one body, it's two. A zygote has the entire DNA blueprint for a human person. It's not your body. It's in your body. It's another body. It's another human person. But the arguments, of course, persisted, and the arguments said, well, this little human has not yet achieved the status of personhood. It's not life worth protecting at this stage. It's primitive. It's a clump of cells. It's, as I said, a product of conception. It's a little nothing. It's just getting rid of it. There's no moral implications whatsoever. But again, of course, science was against us. A heart beats at 4 weeks. I agree with New South Wales Treasurer Dominic Perrottet when he said he couldn't support a law that stops a beating heart. Good point. Pain is felt by 16 weeks, if not sooner. Barely 12 weeks is up before the child is yawning, stretching, making facial expressions. By 22 weeks, it'll live outside the womb. Ultrasound images are being credited with a massive surge of pro-lifers in the younger generations because it's a little person. And not to see that and understand it from the images that we get alone is to be willfully blind. Surgeons who operate on these babies say they, of course, respond to pain. Of course, they need anaesthetic. But of course, Ben Carson recently said quite remarkably that they respond to care and warmth as well. They are individually existing little humans who have sensory functions rapidly developing. But see, as these things become increasingly clear, especially with the advances of medicine and science, of course, the pro-choicers don't change their arguments. Of course, they don't change their minds. They don't admit any error. Instead, they simply make up new angles. And I find that in that changing argument, they've become more and more brazen. They don't any longer actually argue that this isn't, in fact, an act of killing, and therefore it's not outrageous. I find the overwhelming focus of the arguments now is to say, rather, it doesn't matter what I'm doing, because I want to do it. It's contraception. It's my right to equality. It's my body, therefore my choice, with an emphasis now on the I'm choosing this. It's autonomy. It's rights. It's me, myself, and I, because I'm deciding. And therefore I am deciding what is good and what is not. Like God, if I do something, it is good. Like God, if I say something, it makes it real. And I will say what is right and wrong. I will do things that make right and wrong. I will say what's sin and what's righteousness. I'll say what's moral and what's immoral. I'll decide based on how I feel about the situation and what I ultimately do. And that will create reality. Kate Fairman, Greens MLC, in the upper house said this: the majority of adults in this country have sex for enjoyment. And sometimes that will result in pregnancies that are not wanted. This is the world we live in right now. This is our world where half of us are women and where we demand full equality. Clementine Ford tweeted, abortion is a form of contraception. It is the last resort for people for whom other contraceptives have failed. It's not a moral wrong. The There's a verbal exchange recorded at the Upper House inquiry between Greens MLC Abigail Boyd and Anglican Archbishop of Sydney Glenn Davies. And Ms Boyd says that these arguments against abortion, quote, are a mistrust of women to make their own decisions for their own bodies and for themselves. The Archbishop replies, if it were merely a matter of choice for your own body, then I could understand. But when a pregnant mother holds a genetically distinct unborn child, it is not merely her own body. I reject the proposition that this is with regard to her own body. In terms of pro-choice or no choice, what about the choice of the unborn child? Where does he or she find a place in this debate? Ms Boyd replies, I think we would differ on how we conceive of a fetus. Davies says, it is genetically distinct, is it not? Boyd says, it is genetically distinct. Yes, that is right. She says, right, it's true. It's a separate human being, genetically distinct. But see, for her, what's more important, it's her opening statement, the ability of women to make their own decisions and therefore to demand full equality. It's very politically correct language, but it just barely hides the mindset of our times that says, yes, I know what I'm doing, but I have decided that I will do it. And because I have decided, it is good. Because I am good and I make good, and I decide what's good because I am God now. And when I speak, it makes it right. When I decide, it makes it right. That is our world. And you know, it's not a world in which we believe that there is supreme, transcendent, objective truth over us all to which we are accountable, which binds us. It doesn't believe in that anymore. We're well past that. But see, likewise, it's not actually a world which says there's no truth. Notice that. We're not there. We're not in a place that says truth isn't real, it doesn't exist. We're not arguing with silly people who think that truth isn't a thing. They know it's a thing. Also, we're not actually arguing with a world where the language of, well, this is my truth and that's your truth is very often used. I don't see that much. The more specific articulation of what's going on in our time is that it is a world that says, yeah, I know that might be true, but I don't care. Instead, what I care about is what I want. It's what I feel. It's what I have decided to do. And that's just more important. And that's just what matters because I feel and I want. And so the argument becomes circular. That is where we are today. A world in which we have finally decided that we have God's authority to create right and wrong merely by acting and by speaking, to determine good and evil. And we believe earnestly that that is the only way to be happy, to be empowered to be as gods, as was the sin that tempted our first parents. And we react with such anger against those who stand in the way because it's like that's an act of blasphemy to affront my sense of deity, that you would say that I am wrong. Jeremy Rivkin powerfully says this. He's a very influential policy advisor and economist and so forth, quite influential in the EU. He says this, we no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home and therefore obliged to make our behaviour conform to a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. It's our creation now. We make the rules. We establish the parameters of reality. We create the world. And because we do, we no longer feel beholden to outside forces. We no longer have to justify our behaviour. For we are now the architects of the universe. We are responsible to nothing outside ourselves, for we are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. I think he's just saying what people unconsciously believe. It is truly a Romans 1 world in which we worship and serve creature rather than creator. And it's interesting that the example given in Romans 1 of that phenomenon is somebody denying natural reality. Somebody saying, for example, well, you know, it's the homosexual example. And Paul saying, well, nature itself shows you that's not the way it's meant to be. But of course, we believe that what we want and desire is more important. And we should pursue it. And that we can create what's right and wrong. We can create reality itself. And you know, it's a very, very difficult problem to overcome. Because you can't argue with a generation like this by saying, well, see how good my logic is. See how good my arguments are. Look how true my truth is. Can you not see it? Because it's not that they don't see it. It's that they actually don't care, and they can't imagine a world in which they would care because they feel different. And it's a world actually in which they not only don't care, but they are angered by your truth because your truth is oppressive, because it affronts them, because it presses down upon them and demands things of them that they're not prepared to give. And so it is oppression. Michel Foucault, one of the great postmodernist thinkers, said exactly that. Truth claims are power claims. They are oppressive. They victimize people. Run from them. Do not engage. And so I get a little frustrated when I see so many Christians in the public squares who really do think that the logic of argument is still the way forward. In a godless but still secular and scientific world, logical argument had great currency and power. But we are seeing something. And what we are seeing is that logic and argument no longer means diddly squat to a new generation. And in fact, they will flee it. And the whole hard wiring of their brain from cradle to where they are now is been set up in such a way as to say it doesn't matter. In fact, you are bad for pretending that it does. Someone asked me a while ago, when will this whole transgender phenomenon fall in a heap and people realize it's patent nonsense? I said, well, they don't think like you anymore. It's not going to be that way. The only way that it'll fall in a heap and they'll realize it's nonsense if some dreadful, shocking, disruptive and affronting hardship befalls them in which they have to confront reality. You know, a great war or something, some crisis when people forget all this ideology and they have to deal with the brass tacks of the real world, like it or not. But if that doesn't come, do you know something? There's something else that we have to be brave enough to do. And it is testify to something else, not just stop at logic. And we have done wrong by just stopping at logic for so long. Paul wrote into a world just like this in Romans 1. And he starts by pointing something out. For a generation like this, there is one thing he could rely on, and it wasn't his own power of argument. It wasn't his own good logic. It wasn't convincing people of truth claims. No, he said, I can only rely on what? The power of God for salvation to all who believe. He said, I have to go above my pay grade. Romans 1:16. And therefore, I am unashamed of the gospel because it's the gospel that is God's power to change people, to enlighten darkened eyes, to enliven dead minds, to make people see the truth and acknowledge the truth and believe the truth. He says, I need a higher power. I need God's power, and I need it through His tools. God's tools. God's tools are the scriptures. God's tools are the gospel. God's tools are the truths, the lives, the testimonies of Christians that witness back to that. And so I say, yeah, I'm in the political square, I'm in the public square, but I've never been here as an end in itself. I've only ever been here because of Christ who sits behind all that we say. And from time to time, increasingly actually, we just need to be clear about that. Because without His power and the tools that He's given us to fight this fight, we cannot win. The culture is at a point where that has never been clearer. And so that's the world in which we live. Sadly, my truth, what I say is real. And yet God has given us the tools that can even overcome that barrier. So let's take them up and use them with confidence. In all that we say and do, point back to the truth that we actually believe in and stand on. All right, I'm going to deal quickly with a subject now, birth certificates in Victoria. And Victoria, of course, has recently changed the law down there to say that you can change the sex that's been recorded on your birth certificate without undergoing any surgery at all. You just need to nominate it and away you go. Don't have to have an actual sex change. Passed the Victorian Upper House 26-14, which is a big pass. Now it's going to go to the Governor for royal assent. It is effectively law. Children can change the birth certificate as well. They just need parental support and a statement from a doctor or a psychologist. And Victoria now follows Tasmania, the Northern Territory, South Australia and the ACT in adopting these changes. Now, here's the problem. Sex change is impossible, but nonetheless the idea is spreading like a contagion. we have seen through Freedom of Information requests to major gender clinics across Australia a 1,000% increase in children, minors, on hormone therapy, all the way down at that stage of gender reassignment. This actually is happening primarily in Victoria, and it's happening in a state in which the laws of that state, I kid you not, in Victoria, say that an underage minor, person under 18, cannot get a tattoo even with parental consent. I mean, the age of consent exists for a reason. Adulthood at 18 was put in place for a reason. We don't allow children, minors, to make so many decisions that are far more basic than this kind of radical stuff. Candace Owens writes, telling children they can pick their gender is as fundamentally stupid as telling children they can choose their species. If we did, we'd have classrooms filled with mermaids, aquamen, wizards, gnomes, fairies and aliens. It's true. And that's who we're giving the ability to decide whether they're a boy or a girl, to make lifelong body mutilating and to take choices and to take hormones. It's outrageous. It's funny in a way when you read Candace Owens' quote, but it's tragic. Do you know Walt Heyer, I say this often, came to Australia a little while ago, one of the really early gender reassignment patients back in the 50s, became a woman, lived as a woman for a number of years, realised it didn't solve his problems, transitioned back to being a man insofar as you can. You can't do it all the way because of the things that they do to your body. He now runs Transgender Regret, in which just a teeming huge number of people seek out his advice and help when they realise that they've gone down this path and it has not helped them. And he says he sits down with these people and he asks them what went wrong. He said a full 50% will say child sexual abuse. 50%. But nobody checked. They just felt gender dysphoric and so they were pushed down an avenue and a pathway. Others had comorbidities, psychological issues and so on. He says, well, transgenderism doesn't really exist. It's an umbrella that we place over a whole range of concerns that people have and we never deal with them. We just in fact make it worse. And he says, I said, Walt, why are you one of the only people out there speaking out against this stuff, doing the work you're doing? He says, well, I'm 80 odd. He says, I'm one of the only ones that's sufficiently recovered in my own health and psychology to be able to go out there and do this work. That's how seriously it hurts people. And pointing back to my previous topic, here's the reality check we need. Truth matters. It matters supremely. We live in an age that says it doesn't matter. And yet look how much it does. Where there is no truth, there can be no justice. That's the teaching of Isaiah 59. When truth stumbles in the public squares, righteousness is lost because you don't have the truth about what is right and wrong. And when there's no righteousness, there's no justice because you cannot have that which is right being enforced and therefore justice comes. And when that which is wrong is enforced, when lies have the ascendancy, when falsehood is enshrined in legislation even to this degree, what do you get? Injustice. You get the youngest and most vulnerable among us led down these evil pathways and their lives are being destroyed. And many of them will end up being refugees from this crazy phenomenon. They'll be ostracised from the movement. There's a guy in Perth I talked to recently who detransitioned and realised what nonsense it was and how he'd been led down the garden path and had really done great harm to himself. But they dropped him like that as soon as he said to them that he didn't believe in it anymore. And now he's looking for a home, and he's found a home in the church. And I fear, well, maybe fear might not be the right word, but I believe that the church will have to step up and pick up the pieces of young lives that have been gravely harmed by this. Truth matters. Even the simple truth of a historical event like a birth and whether that baby is a boy or a girl. Look where a society goes when we trample it underfoot and we no longer value what ultimately is God's and what ultimately defines God, which is that He is the truth, the author of truth, and the one who set all truth in place for our good. I'm going to finish this episode by looking at Father's Day. Father's Day was, of course, last weekend, but nonetheless I want to say a few things about it. I do believe, and I speak from experience, I'm one of the lucky ones, one of the blessed ones. I'm acutely aware of that. But I do earnestly believe, and I've thought hard about this, that apart from salvation itself, there is no single greater blessing that a man can have than a godly father. I say that because demographers, I say I'm lucky, because demographers are confirming that fatherlessness is one of the fastest growing trends in society. It has been for some time. It's in fact a cultural crisis. 81.8% of single parent families in Australia right now are headed by women. It's a huge disproportionality of fatherlessness. Children of single parent homes are more likely themselves to become single parents or to divorce. In fact, they're also more likely to live in poverty. That's Australian data. From the UK, we see that children from broken homes are 9 times more likely to commit violent crimes. 7 in 10 criminals in the UK come from broken homes. In the USA, we see that fatherlessness, specifically from studies done there, accounts for 63% of youth suicides, are young people without fathers. 90% of homeless and runaway youths are fatherless. 85% of children that exhibit behavioural disorders are fatherless. 71% of high school dropouts are fatherless. 70% of juveniles in state-operated institutions. 75% of adolescent patients in substance abuse centres. 75% of rapists motivated by displaced anger. A US study on fatherless girls found that they are 53% more likely to marry as teenagers. They are 111% more likely to have children as teenagers. They are 164% more likely to have a premarital birth. They are 90% more likely to dissolve their own marriages. These studies are very real. One quote from the study says, father-deprived girls show precocious sexual interest, derogation of masculinity and males, and poor ability to maintain sexual and emotional adjustment with one male. A higher level of self-control in school children with involved fathers was also associated with many other healthy qualities, such as improved general life skills, self-esteem, and higher social skills. These are quotes from the studies. And you see from those overwhelming statistics and the studies that have been done that fatherlessness is indeed a great tragedy, and it's an increasing tragedy. It's getting to the stage where a young person is singularly fortunate to have a father, let alone a godly father. But I wonder actually whether we, including Christian people, have been affected in our own thinking by our fatherless culture in a way that's maybe a little more subtle than we realise. I've actually known quite a number of women who aspire to be mothers. I recently heard one say that there is no higher calling. And that's very likely true. And we're acutely aware of the loss of that attitude from society and the loss of the value of motherhood. But I think we've forgotten the same in relation to fatherhood. Because most men ought to aspire to fatherhood and actually aspire to it beyond other things that men normally aspire to, like career and success and all these sorts of things, or even marriage, but not so much fatherhood. And I'm not sure that I've ever heard many men, any men, disclose a desire such as that. And yet this is surely one of the most urgent needs of our day. Just as motherhood is a high calling, fatherhood, God is described as a father. It is a tremendously high calling, and it's God's order for most men in the natural course of things. It's one of the most urgent needs of our day. The sons and daughters of this entire generation, as we've just seen, whether they know it or not, are crying out for their fathers, and the social impact of fatherlessness is awful. And we look to what is the call of Christ on a godly man. Well, he calls that man to give up his life for those that he has commanded to love. It's a powerful call. And for most, that begins with his family. And that's a principle articulated, for example, in Ephesians 5, where Paul says, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water and the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendour, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. And a man is called to love his family and love his family to be holy, because that's what's in their highest and best interest, and that's what Christ desires for them. He desires for them that righteousness without which no one shall see the Lord, to desire their purity, their perfection, their holiness, and he is to lay down his life in the service of that cause for his family. This is a primary, a basic calling for most men. You say, well, to what end? Well, observe, therefore, particularly in that context, it makes perfect sense, how many titans of the faith in Scripture have the influence of their God-fearing parents specifically singled out. You look to Moses, you look to Samuel, you look to David, you look to Timothy, you look to Jesus with Joseph and Mary. Tremendous parents of godly integrity. And you think the notion of patriarchs itself in the Old Testament shows this godly fatherhood that is so often seen, and the tremendous impact that it has, because parenting is a ministry of enormous importance. It's a ministry that directly impacts our eternal legacy for Christ in this way. And I think we've forgotten the call to be fathers, because we live in a fatherless generation that therefore cares little for fatherhood and for motherhood, and in fact denigrates both of them in many respects. But the way of the Lord is different, and the way of the Lord is good. I'm Martyn Iles, and that was the truth of it.